Oh, Mary, don't you don't you mourn. Oh, Mary, don't you mourn because the old army got grounded. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Oh, Mary, don't you mourn. Oh, Mary, don't you mourn because the old army got grounded. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Some of these things are 12 o'clock. This old world is gonna.
Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Jason Kishinev. Welcome back to A People's Historian, where we read about 30 minutes of history together. We're reading chapter 13 of A People's History of the United States, reading about socialism in the early 20th century, and we started talking about women's rights, women's movement, Mother Mary Jones. So let's just dig in, shall we? In the laundries, women organized. In 1909, the Handbook of the Women's Trade Union Industrial League wrote about women in steam laundries. How would you like to iron a shirt a minute? Think of standing at a mangle just above the washroom with the hot steam pouring up through the floor for 10, 12, 14, and sometimes 17 hours a day. Sometimes the floors are made of cement, and then it seems as though one were standing on hot coals, and the workers are dripping with perspiration. They are breathing air laden with particles of soda, ammonia, and other chemicals. The Laundry Workers Union in one city reduced this long day to 9 hours and has increased the wages 50%. Labor struggles could make things better, but the country's resources remained in the hands of powerful corporations whose motive was profit, whose power commanded the government of the United States. There was an idea in the air, becoming clearer and stronger, an idea not just in the theories of Karl Marx, but in the dreams of writers and artists through the ages, that people might cooperatively use the treasures of the earth to make life better for everyone, not just a few. There's a novel thought. As my friend Vespa from the Bohemian said, there's a radical idea I can get behind. Around the turn of the century, strike struggles were multiplying. In the 1890s, there had been about 1,000 strikes a year. By 1904, there were 4,000 strikes a year. See, that's what I'm talking about. 4,000 strikes a year, and I only hear about a few strikes. Law and military force, again and again, took the side of the rich. It was a time when hundreds of thousands of Americans began to think of socialism. Dun dun dun. Debs wrote in 1904, 3 years after the formation of the Socialist Party, "The pure and simple trades union of the past does not answer the requirements of today. The attempt of each trade to maintain its own independence separately and apart from others results in increasing jurisdictional entanglements, fruitful of dissension, strife, and ultimate disruption. The members of a trade union should be taught that the labor movement means more, infinitely more, than a paltry increase in wages and the strike necessary to secure it. That while it engages to do all that possibly can be done to better the working conditions of its members, its higher object is to overthrow the capitalist system of private ownership of the tools of labor, abolish wage slavery, and achieve the freedom of the whole working class, and in fact of all mankind." What Debs accomplished was not in theory or analysis, but in expressing eloquently, passionately, what people were feeling. The writer Haywood Brown once quoted a fellow socialist speaking of Debs. "That old man with the burning eyes actually believes that there can be such a thing as the brotherhood of man." And that's not the funniest part of it. As long as he's around, I believe it myself. Eugene Debs had become a socialist while in jail in the Pullman strike. Now he was the spokesman of a party that made him its presidential candidate 5 times. 5 times? The party at one time had 100,000 members and 1,200 office holders in 340 municipalities. Wow. Its main newspaper, Appeal to Reason, for which Debs wrote, had 500,000 subscribers, and there were many other socialist newspapers around the country, so that altogether perhaps 1 million people read the socialist press. Socialism moved out of the small circles of city immigrants, Jewish and German socialists speaking their own languages, and became American. The strongest socialist state organization, you're not going to believe this, Oklahomans, was in Oklahoma, which in 1914 had 12,000 dues-paying members, more than New York State, and elected over 100 socialists to local office, including 6 to the Oklahoma State Legislature. It's a far cry from the red state that it is now, huh? There were 55 weekly socialist newspapers in Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and summer encampments that drew thousands of people. James Green describes these Southwest radicals in his book Grassroots Socialism as indebted homesteaders, migratory tenant farmers, coal miners and railroad workers, red-bone lumberjacks from the piney woods, preachers and school teachers from the sun-baked prairies, village artisans and atheists, the unknown people who created the strongest regional socialist movement in United States history, Green continues. The socialist movement was painstakingly organized by scores of former populists, militant miners, and blacklisted railroad workers who were assisted by a remarkable cadre of professional agitators and educators, and inspired by occasional visits from national figures like Eugene V. Debs and Mother Jones. This corps of organizers grew to include indigenous dissenters, a much larger group of amateur agitators who canvassed the region selling newspapers, forming reading groups, organizing locals, and making soapbox speeches. There was almost a religious fervor to the movement, as in the eloquence of Debs. In 1906, after the imprisonment in Idaho of Bill Haywood and 2 other officers of the Western Federation of Miners on an apparently faked murder charge, Debs wrote a flaming article in the Appeal to Reason. Murder has been plotted and is about to be executed in the name and under the forms of law. It is a foul plot, a damnable conspiracy, a hellish outrage. If they attempt to murder Moyer, Haywood, and their brothers, 1 million revolutionists at least will meet them with guns. Capitalist courts never have done and never will do anything for the working class. A special revolutionary convention of the proletariat would be in order, and if extreme measures are required, a general strike could be ordered and industry paralyzed as a preliminary to a general uprising. If the plutocrats begin the program, we will end it. Theodore Roosevelt, after reading this, sent a copy to his Attorney General, W.H. Moody, with the note, "Is it possible to proceed against Debs and the proprietor of this paper criminally?" As the socialists became more successful at the polls, Deb got 900,000 votes in 1912, double what he had in 1908, and more concerned with increasing that appeal. They became more critical of IWW tactics of sabotage and violence, and in 1913 removed Bill Haywood from the Socialist Party Executive Committee, claiming he advocated violence, although some of Debs's writings were far more inflammatory. Women were active in the socialist movement, more as rank-and-file workers than as leaders, and sometimes as sharp critics of socialist policy. Helen Keller, for instance, the gifted blind, mute, deaf woman with her extraordinary social vision, commented on the expulsion of Bill Haywood in a letter to the New York Call. It is with the deepest regret that I have read the attacks upon Comrade Haywood, such an ignoble strife between two factions which should be one, and that too at a most critical period in the struggle of the proletariat. What? Are we to put difference of party tactics before the desperate needs of the workers? While countless women and children are breaking their hearts and ruining their bodies in long days of toil, we are fighting one another. Shame upon us. Only 3% of the Socialist Party's members were women in 1904. At the National Convention that year, there were only 8 women delegates, but in a few years, local socialist women's organizations and a national magazine, Socialist Woman, began bringing more women into the party, so that by 1913, 15% of the membership was women. The editor of Socialist Woman, Josephine Conger Kaneko, insisted on the importance of separate groups for women. In a separate organization, the most unsophisticated little woman may soon learn to preside over a meeting, to make motions, and to defend her stand with a little speech. After a year or two of this sort of practice, she is ready to work with the men, and there is a mighty difference between working with the men and simply sitting in obedient reverence under the shadow of their aggressive power. Socialist women were active in the feminist movement of the early 1900s. According to Kate Richards O'Hare, the socialist leader from Oklahoma, New York women socialists were superbly organized. During the 1915 campaign in New York for a referendum on women's suffrage, in one day at the climax of the campaign, they distributed 60,000 English leaflets, 50,000 Yiddish leaflets, sold 2,500 1-cent books and 1,500 5-cent books, put up 40,000 stickers, and held 100 meetings. But were there problems of women that went beyond politics and economics that would not be solved automatically by a socialist system? Once the economic base of sexual oppression was corrected, would equality follow? Battling for the vote, or for anything less than revolutionary change, was that pointless? The argument became sharper as the women's movement of the early 20th century grew, as women spoke out more, organized, protested, paraded for the vote and for recognition as equals in every sphere, including sexual relations and marriage. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose writing emphasized the crucial question of economic equality between the sexes, wrote a poem called The Socialist and the Suffragist, ending with, "A lifted world lifts women up." The socialist explained, "You cannot lift the world at all while half of it is kept so small," the suffragist maintained. The world awoke and tartly spoke. "Your work is all the same. Work together or work apart. Work each of you with all your heart. Just get into the game." I like it. When Susan Anthony, noticeably without the B, at 80, went to hear Eugene Debs speak 25 years before, he had gone to hear her 25, so hard sentence. When Susan Anthony at 80 went to hear Eugene Debs speak 25 years before, he had gone to hear her speak, and they had not met since then, They clasped hands warmly, then had a brief exchange. She said, laughing, "Give us suffrage and we'll give you socialism." Debs replied, "Give us socialism and we'll give you suffrage." There were women who insisted on uniting the two aims of socialism and feminism, like Crystal Eastman, who imagined new ways of men and women living together and retaining their independence, different from traditional marriage. She was a socialist, but wrote once that a woman knows the whole of women's slavery is not summed up in the profit system, nor her complete emancipation assured by the downfall of capitalism. In the first 15 years of the 20th century, there were more women in the labor force, more with experience in labor struggles. Some middle-class women, conscious of women's oppression and wanting to do something, were going to college and becoming aware of themselves as not just housewives. The historian William Chpt writes, "Female college students were infused with a self-conscious sense of mission and a passionate commitment to improve the world. They became doctors, college professors, settlement houseworkers, businesswomen, lawyers, and architects. Spirited by an intense sense of purpose as well as camaraderie, they set a remarkable record of accomplishment in the face of overwhelming odds. Jane Addams, Grace and Edith Abbott, Alice Hamilton, Julia Lathrop, Florence Kelley, all came out of this pioneering generation and set the agenda of social reform for the first 2 decades of the 20th century. They were defying the culture of mass magazines, which were spreading the message of women as companion, wife, homemaker. Some of these feminists married, some did not. All struggled with the problem of relations with men, like Margaret Sanger, pioneer of birth control education, who suffered a nervous breakdown inside an apparently happy but confining marriage. She had to leave husband and children to make a career for herself and feel whole again. Sanger had written in Women and the New Race, "No woman can call herself free who does not own and control her own body. No woman can call herself free until she can choose conscientiously whether she will or will not be a mother." It was a complicated problem. Kate Richards O'Hare, for example, believed in the home, but thought socialism would make that better. When she ran for Congress in 1910 in Kansas City, she said, "I long for domestic life, home, and children with every fiber of my being. Socialism is needed to restore the home." On the other hand, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn wrote in her autobiography, Rebel Girl, "A domestic life and possibly a large family had no attraction for me. I wanted to speak and write, to travel, to meet people, to see places, to organize for the IWW. I saw no reason why I as a woman should give up my work for this." While many women in this time were radicals, socialists, anarchists, an even larger number were involved in the campaign for suffrage, and the mass support for feminism came from them. Veterans of trade union struggles joined the suffrage movement, like Rose Schneiderman of the garment workers. At a Cooper Union meeting in New York, she replied to a politician who said that women, given the vote, would lose their femininity. Women in the laundries stand for 13 or 14 hours in the terrible steam and heat with their hands in hot starch. Surely these women won't lose any more of their beauty and charm by putting a ballot in a ballot box once a year than they are likely to lose standing in foundries or laundries all year round. Every spring in New York, the parades for women's suffrage kept growing. In 1912, a news report. All along Fifth Avenue, from Washington Square, where the parade formed, on 57th Street, where it disbanded, were gathered thousands of men and women of New York. They blocked every cross street on the line of march. Many were inclined to laugh and jeer, but none did. The sight of the impressive column of women striding 5 abreast up the middle of the street stifled all thought of ridicule. Women doctors, women lawyers, women architects, women artists, actresses and sculptors, women waitresses, domestics, a huge division of industrial workers, all marched with an intensity and purpose that astonished the crowds that lined the streets. From Washington in the spring of 1913 came a New York Times report. In a women's suffrage demonstration today, the Capitol saw the greatest parade of women in its history. In the parade, over 5,000 women passed down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was an astonishing demonstration. It was estimated that 500,000 persons watched the women march for their cause. Some women radicals were skeptical. Emma Goldman, the anarchist and feminist, spoke her mind forcefully, as always, on the subject of women's suffrage. Our modern fetish is universal suffrage. The women of Australia and New Zealand can vote and help make the laws. Are the labor conditions better there? The history of the political activities of man proves that they have given him absolutely nothing that he could not have achieved in a more direct, less costly, and more lasting manner. As a matter of fact, every inch of ground he has gained has been through a constant fight, a ceaseless struggle for self-assertion, and not through suffrage. There is no reason whatever to assume that women, in her climb to emancipation, has been or will be helped by the ballot. Her development, her freedom, her independence must come from and through herself. First, by asserting herself as a personality. Second, by refusing the right to anyone over her body. By refusing to bear children unless she wants them. By refusing to be a servant of God, the state, society, the husband, the family, etc. By making her life simpler, but deeper and richer. Only that, and not by the ballot, will set the woman free. Only that, and not the ballot, will set the woman free. And Helen Keller, writing in 1911 to a suffragist in England, our democracy is but a name. We vote. What does that mean? It means that we choose between two bodies of real, though not avowed, autocrats. We choose between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Well, things haven't changed much. You ask for votes for women. What good can votes do when 10/11ths of the land of Great Britain belongs to 200,000 and only 1/11th to the rest of the 40 million? Have your men with their millions of votes freed themselves from this injustice? Burn! Emma Goldman was not postponing the changing of women's conditions to some future socialist era. She wanted action more direct, more immediate than the vote. Helen Keller was, while not an anarchist, also believed in continuous struggle outside the ballot box. Blind, deaf, she fought with her spirit, her pen. When she became active and openly socialist, the Brooklyn Eagle, which had previously treated her as a heroine, wrote that her mistakes spring out of the manifest limitations of her development. Her response was not accepted by the Eagle, but printed in the New York Call. She wrote that when once she met the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle, he complimented her lavishly. But now that I have come out for socialism, he reminds me and the public that I am blind and deaf and especially liable to error. She added, "Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle. What an ungallant bird it is, socially blind and deaf. It defends an intolerable system, a system that is the cause of much of the physical blindness and deafness which we are trying to prevent. The eagle and I are at war. I hate the system which it represents. When it fights back, let it fight fair. It is not fighting fair or good argument to remind me and others that I cannot see or hear. I can read. I can read all the socialist books I have time for in English, German, and French. If the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle should read some of them, he might be a wiser man and make a better newspaper. If I ever contribute to the socialist movement, the book that I sometimes dream of, I know what I shall name it. Industrial Blindness and Social Deafness. Mother Jones did not seem especially interested in the feminist movement. She was busy organizing textile workers and miners and organizing their wives and children. One of her many feats was the organization of a children's march to Washington to demand the end of child labor. As the 20th century opened, 284,000 children between the ages of 10 and 15 worked in mines, mills, and factories. She described this. In the spring of 1903, I went to Kensington, Pennsylvania, where 75,000 textile workers were on strike. Of this number, at least 10,000 were little children. The workers were striking for more pay and shorter hours. Every day, little children came into the union headquarters, some with their hands off, some with the thumb missing, some with their fingers off at the knuckle. They were stooped little things, round-shouldered and skinny. I asked some of the parents if they would let me have their little boys and girls for a week or 10 days, promising to bring them back safe and sound. A man named Sweeney was marshal. A few men and women went with me. The children carried knapsacks on their backs in which was a knife and a fork, a tin cup and a plate. One little fellow had a drum and another had a fife. We carried banners that said, "We want time to play." The children marched through New Jersey and New York and down to Oyster Bay to try to see President Theodore Roosevelt, but he refused to see them. But our march had done its work. We had drawn the attention of the nation to the crime of child labor. That same year, children working 60 hours a week in textile mills in Philadelphia went on strike, carrying signs, "We want to go to school. 55 hours or nothing." Wow, 55 hours. One gets a sense of energy and fire of some of those turn-of-the-century radicals by looking at the police record of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. 1906 to 1916, organizer, lecturer for IWW. 1918 to 1924, organizer for Workers' Defense Union. Arrested in New York, 1906, free speech case, dismissed, active in Spokane, Washington. Free speech fight, 1909, arrested, Missoula, Montana. 1909, in free speech fight of IWW, Spokane, Washington. Free speech fight of IWW, hundreds arrested. In Philadelphia, arrested 3 times, 1911, at strike meetings of Baldwin Locomotive Works, active in Lawrence textile strike. 1912, hotel workers strike. 1912, New York, Patterson textile strike. 1913, defense work for Ettore Giovannitti case. 1912, Masaba Range strike, Minnesota. 1916, Everett IWW case, Spokane, Washington. 1916, Joe Hill defense. 1914, arrested, Duluth, Minnesota, 1917, charged with vagrancy under law passed to stop IWW and pacifist speakers, case dismissed, indicted in Chicago IWW case, 1917. And then it goes ... I guess that means it goes on. And let's end the episode there. Thank you very much for joining in. I hope you'll tune in next time, and I also hope that you will hit the like and subscribe button and the notification bell. Catch you later.